if you don't realize, I try to keep the videos down to about 10 minutes because, man, they could get lengthy. Also, it's easier if you download videos in just 10-minute time periods so I'm not sitting here waiting for hours for the stuff to go through. So I try to limit to 10 minutes. So in 10 minutes, I have a timer and it just shuts off. So that's, that's the easiest way to keep me quiet. And if you've had me in your classes before, I can talk forever. All right. So basically, this is the first folder, Causal Relationships. You click on it and it'll bring you, I'm going to go to the student version so that you can see that it's right over here. So Causal Relationships. Um, I have the PDF right here, and then I have a simple assignment right here, right? Add two new causal relationships. Keep it simple, right? So here's a causal relationship, right? Um, Gender affects income, right? Gender, the type of variables that it is. The income is the type of variable that it is, right? List the categories, within one, man and women in dollars. And then here's educational effects. Uh, Education is the interval level category. Uh, the years of education could be in high school versus college, and then occupation is nominal. So I kind of want you to do something similar over here with just different variables, right? Just follow this. Then causal effects, list 10 causal effects you would like to research, right? So here is uh, basically some areas that people like to study. So if you think about um, uh, migration, well, what's a causal effect in migration? Income, what's a causal effect in income? Gender, right? These are the list of variables in areas that people study. Now, you can find out that there's no causal effect for gender per se that sociologists study, right? It's biological. It's an ascribed characteristics. So therefore, it's not something that you kind of like get. It just is. So therefore, it's not so much what affects gender as um, what gender affects, right? So gender has an effect on income. That is a causal effect, right? Um, Sex as different from gender, right? Gender meaning the sociological um, uh, identity of femininity and masculinity. Sex being what we describe usually as male and female. We understand these distinctions, right? And we understand the issue of identities around this. This is why I kind of put it in there. But it also could mean, studying the act of sexual behavior. So I don't want you to just think of it that way. It could be much more complicated than that if you want to. Occupation, education, home ownership, family structures, all this stuff is areas that sociologists cover, and this is just to give you an idea of things that you can be looking at. And so you would list uh, at least 10 causal relationships. So, independent, dependent variable. Here, let me spend a few minutes talking about this real quick. So when we talk about causal relationships, what we're talking about is your just basic relationship of X causing Y. Well, what's X? Well, X is what we refer to as the independent variable. The independent variable is the variable that basically has an effect on that other variable, that dependent variable. Usually we refer to the independent variable as X and the dependent variable as Y. What is a variable? A variable is a characteristic that changes from your subject to the other subject that you're studying. So for example, if you're looking at people, then it would be the characteristics that changes from person to person. If your subjects are cities, then it's the characteristics that changes from city to city. If your subjects are, for example, educational institutions, then your variables which change from one school to the other school that you were studying. We study organizations, we study cities, we study countries, we study people. So we study institutions. All those things are things that sociologists study. And so the characteristic of a variable are those things that change from that subject to the other, right? So, for example, just to give you a quick example, gender is a great example, right? You have one category within gender It doesn't have to be just male and female, right? It could be, depending on how you're identifying, it could be much different than that. But typically we have just one, we own one category within there. Because people have much more complicated identities, sometimes they will use today the term queer, or they would use the term non-binary, right? These are terms that reflect ways in which they do not want to be identified into the two traditional categories within that gender category. But you still fall into just one category, right? That is the category within the variable. Same thing with age. You're only one age, right? And so that age is your education level. You only have one education level at a time, but each person has their own education level. And then you have the dependent variable, which is how this affects. How does the X affects the dependent variable? Well, for example, your education level will affect your income. Right? That's why most of you are here, because you know that it'll affect your income. So that's why so this is what this means, the basic causal relationship. And most of our research is going to be focusing on a causal relationship. What I have here are much more complicated relationships that sociologists continue to study, but we study and have different techniques for looking at them. And although most of our research are going to be on causal relationship, it is important to get an understanding of what these other relationships are, right? You have a contingent relationship, which is where, you can have, for example, education having an effect on income, and then of course your income determining the number of children that you have, right? Or your income determining whether you get married. An intervening relationship is something that falls in between. You might have an education, but, your diploma, the degree, might determine, your income, right? So an intervening relationship is something, the place you live might have an intervening relationship, right? An antecedent relationship is one that takes prior to so your parents' income will determine your education level, which will then determine your income. Or your parents' education determines your education, which determines your income. Matter of fact, father education usually is the one that has had the most significant effect, although we see mothers in some cases as well. There are other types of relationships that are much more complicated, right? Multicollinearity is one where two variables are affecting one, but the two variables are also affecting each other. The spurious relationship, where it looks like one variable might be causing the other, but it's actually causing two separate functions. I'm not getting too much into these because, again, these are not the ones, we're not covering all of this. We're not studying all these different types of causal relationships. Our analysis is really going to be focusing on just the causal relationship, the straightforward causal relationship. Extraneous relationships, conjoint relationships, but we do study these. Sociologists actually spend a lot of time understanding this, usually using qualitative analysis. By the time we get to this point, it becomes much more complicated to understand the social process taking shape. Here we have moderate relationship, confounding relationships, these complex causal relationships like contextual relationship, eclectic relationships, which is one of the most difficult relationships to get because now they're all causing each other. Usually when you describe, like for example, urban governments and urban settings, this is usually what you're describing because you have these forces are all always affecting each other. So if you're looking at, for example, the city council and the mayor and the business community, they're all and then you add into this relationship, just adding more groups, right? You got political parties and groups that try to influence government, and it just becomes a very complicated mess. So all of these are areas that sociologists study, and there are different techniques of studying them, and they're all wonderful ways of doing it. But for us, we're going to be doing the causal relationship. It is important to understand all these other ones, but the causal relationship is key. In the next video that I'm going to add, I'm going to be talking about the variables and the characteristics of variables, and you're going to have to learn those variables and those characteristics and variables. But this is just a basic introduction to kind of get your mind thinking about it. And remember, keep it simple. Don't get overcomplicated. And I'm up to my 10 minutes, which is good, which is why I try to keep these videos at 10 minutes at the most. There might be a thing where it will be multiple videos, but they should be working straightforward. I hope you guys are getting this and that this is working well. Get back to me if it's not.